All right, looks like we're live for Conversations from the Underground, episode 22. We took a hiatus last week. That's why we weren't able to record. So it's been a minute, at least 2 weeks, but we're back. When those type of episodes occur, we'll try to be more, uh, transparent or informative about us missing an episode. But outside of that, it is what it is. But we're back at it. What's going on, man?
Yeah, man, for real. It's very underground esque as well to just kind of disappear every now and then. So, probably going to happen here and there. I missed the longest amount of time. I missed more days this past stint here than I have my entire 15-year career combined. Yeah, it was tough. Kidney stones, done with it all though. Pain is real interesting. I've been thinking a lot about pain lately, man, because when I was in pain for 3 days straight without any relief, you start going crazy. You start thinking all kinds of things. You really just sell your soul to anybody to get that pain to go away. Yeah, and it just kind of makes you think about the effectiveness or lack thereof of torture.
Oh, dude, I was just about to say that. I was thinking the entire time you were saying pain, I was thinking, man, I wonder, what type of credible evidence we got from water torture.
Yeah.
Or is that what it's called? Waterboarding. I'm sorry.
Yeah, waterboarding for sure.
Waterboarding as a form of exacting so-called information based on types of torture. But I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. But dude, I'm on the same.
Started that off with the Philippines, right, in the Spanish-American War. They're waterboarding insurgents.
I didn't know that.
While they visited on them, while Roosevelt was over there getting the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Russo-Japanese War, he was overseeing the extermination in many cases of Filipino people who didn't really agree with the form of imperialism that the United States was imposing upon them,
right.
After placing the Spanish. And it's interesting, to what effect are these things? I mean, I don't know. It's hard. Like, I felt like I was mind right. I was strong. I was able to survive 2 days, 2.5 days. But about the third morning, I just kept thinking to myself, I'm going to go through this pain again. Oh my God, I can't deal with this. And you think about when people lock people up or all these forms of torture, the way that it affects your mind, man. Like you can really think things are real when your body tells you need to, or when you feel like you're a reaction or a tool kind of mechanism, survival mechanism or something, where your brain can make you think all kinds of crazy stuff. And so it just kind of makes you think about all the people in history and different forms of torture. And gosh, it's crazy.
Yeah. Anybody that's ever been held captive, usually by an enemy force, is probably subjected to some form of torture at one point in time, whether it be, Guevara, whether it's Patrice Lumumba. With the Liberian Revolution, I thought that was the early 90s, or, one of their many civil wars where we begin to hear about child soldiers and what were those type of butt naked generals of Liberia, where they were torturing former presidents. I think his name was Doe. And then for them to record it too, it's kind of wild. But I was thinking about the other element of that, where you're under. It sounds to me and of course, correct me because I don't know what you were going through in that moment, but that maybe your mind plays tricks on you a bit, and then I don't know, in the inverse, maybe like individuals that are tired of the pain. And they want to, let's say, for example, if they're suffering through some form of cancer, and they're tired of chemo, or they're tired of treatment, and they want to I guess, engage in what would be like what physician assisted suicide.
Sure, euthanasia.
Yeah. So, I wonder, it just sounds to me like when you're in that type of pain, your mind, I guess, downshifts, and maybe your critical thinking skills are getting primal, because you're just at the end of the day, I mean, the universal language, unfortunately, might be pain.
Right.
Everybody understands it. I mean, you can see it on people's faces. You don't even got to feel it, but you can see pain. You can feel pain for sure, but seeing it and not knowing a person's culture, not knowing a person's history, not knowing a person's language, you can still see that. So I wonder. Now, granted, that doesn't sound pleasant. That the universal language of the human race might be pain, but
yeah, well, interesting too. Culturally speaking, pain has meant a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I've been wanting to think about this a little bit more over the course of the week, but I hadn't had time. But this idea, like, reminds me of these berserkers and the Viking cultures of the early navigational periods, when they were invading England in 800 ADs. These people sort of glorified, many of them glorified pain in a way. That's how there were several Native American cultures that had this similar kind of perception of pain and torture as if you can bear it, saying a lot about you and trying to battle it,
Or for sure, I think it's tied to that concept that you have an elevated sense of masculinity. I mean, even you said for those first 2 days, I was able to handle it. Almost as what I'm saying, like if as it make why do we have to endure pain? Why is it perceived that I have to go through this? Yo, give me that epidural or whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, why is my masculinity in question if I don't want to endure this pain? And that it sounds to me that you're saying it's we could trace it all the way back as far back as tribal respect. I guess a sexualized version of respect, as a form of manhood or manliness.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting, and if you take another angle that just hit me, one of the key aspects of Buddhism is suffering, right? And it's this idea of like taking this eightfold path in life that's filled with suffering, like put yourself through it to reach truth. Maybe there is something to that. I don't know. But I do know that my wife, when I got home, was like, dang, I wish you were sick again because of how nice you were to me, versus getting into arguments, whatever, you get back into your daily thing.
Right.
It's like when you, maybe there's something to this effect that this raw emotion, if you can allow yourself or endure this raw emotion, it maybe opens up certain lights or truths or perceptions that are otherwise locked or something. I mean, all religions have their aesthetics, right? Asceticism is that kind of like, the monks that would whip themselves, the Christian monks that be in there beating themselves up,
right?
Has to be catching themselves on fire and just sitting there straight up dying in Tibet. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you hear about people going through the fire, as a trial or tribulation of an individual with his spirituality. You hear oftentimes baptism by fire, and that this whole notion of suffering may not necessarily be physical, but suffering in that eightfolded path would be just the experiences of your journey, and that the longer you live, the greater or more experiences you're likely to have, and then that broadens your understanding of what is this, what is life, what are we doing as a way to explain existence for Buddhists. I guess I don't know, but um, yeah, I think one thing about enduring suffering as a form of masculinity, it's definitely a demonstration of, I guess, your strength of character and strength of like your physicality. But I think you know, women endure a great deal, or women um, um, have emotional strength that I think is not often brought up, and so that that they endure certain pains, but maybe emotional pains, and they maybe handle them a bit differently than men do in our society.
Yeah, I mean, culture certainly defines oftentimes the roles that gender play, how you're supposed to respond to certain behaviors and actions. Uh, but I don't know. But back to this idea of raw emotion, I do think that Buddhism is about this: depriving yourself of worldly pleasures, starving yourself, becoming a beggar, walking the streets, being in like huge amounts of pain. Um, Maybe not just pain, but all types of emotions. The key is to sort of I don't know. There's something that occurs in humanity, like when your family member dies, and then you go to a funeral, and for like a couple of days, everything is just so different, right?
Mm,
Because
mhm.
feeling emotion is strong at that point, maybe, and you're zeroing in before you get back to your daily life and forget about all these maybe raw core elements of humanity, suffering.
Mm.
Um,
It sounds to me like are you saying something along the lines like these episodes of pain brings you back to the center, and so you're more in tune, I
mhm.
guess, with
Grounded, grounds you and tunes you.
right grounded. I'm sorry, grounded would probably be the better word. You're more grounded to maybe what should be important, and you're not distracted by, I guess, the material world
Right.
um, when you do have these experiences. Maybe because again, because pain's universal. That's why you're so grounded. That you know it keeps you in tune with everything and everyone else. Because everybody understands it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are universal in humanity.
Shit, I
Right.
mean, I see it in animals. I see pain in animals.
Yeah, certainly.
Uh,
Pain, I think, in sentient beings,
mm,
you're gonna feel pain. You're gonna feel comfort. You're gonna feel pleasure, sadness, happiness. What triggers those emotions, though, and how you interpret them seems to be very drastically different in different societies.
for sure.
The the humanism movement, and the rise of modern era, I think, has made us much. We have a much different historical relationship with pain and suffering than even 200, 250 years ago. Just the epidural issue, like, uh, and giving birth, which could very well be the most painful thing that a human being goes through.
Right.
Uh, the doctor said that it was kidney stones was there, but he was a man, and leave it up to a man to say something like that. As painful
Ab-
as the kidney stones were, it kept going through my mind while I was having them. I was like, "There's no way that this could be as like. There's no way that childbirth could be this easy. Like, and it was painful. I was in pain, but I kept telling myself, "There's no way that like I was handling it." I'm like, and I think I maybe could have kept handling it if I didn't think I was gonna die, and these fools didn't
mm,
really know what was going on. And that's another thing. Like when you're having a child, you're about to have a baby, and all these emotions are gonna come out when you have that kid. When you're passing a kidney stone, you're passing a rock. I mean, you like,
yeah.
that has a lot to do with it too. Like your experiences with that pain, how people go through it. A lot of women who go through female genital mutilation, in some of these countries where it is considered a rite of passage, where or a man gets circumcised when he's a teenager, and it's like the circle, and it's painful, and everybody's doing it. It almost was kind of like the way my dad would laugh about when I told him about these having these kidney stones. Kind of like, yeah, it's your time.
Mm.
They go through it, all their brothers, and they got all these stories about this pain, and
Right. It's
yeah,
almost a rite of passage.
yeah, yeah. Like
But
painful experiences sometimes become rites of passages.
for sure. Yeah, for sure. You know,
Maybe as a coping mechanism. I don't know.
is it a coping mechanism? I don't know if it's a coping mechanism, but I could say that what it in this whole notion of it grounding you, it does create this bond as well. You know, like for example, um, when and this is often, and this is all straight from what I hear from my family members. My dad being a Marine, but many of my family members are in the Marine Corps. They would make the argument all the time, like boot camp is this experience that everyone has. You know, it doesn't matter what branch of the military you go to, everybody goes to the same boot camp to some degree. And you all go through this gauntlet, you know, to figure out who's going to be able to tough it out. And it's through that experience, there's a sense of bonding and camaraderie as you share that struggle, you share that pain.
Yeah.
And so there's community around that, that, that pain.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's certainly a good point. Scholars of the African diaspora make this
right.
point clearly as
Hmm.
well, right?
For sure.
The kind of African syncretism, where you have the merging of these different cultural identities. You got 400 people on the bottom of a boat for 6 to 8 weeks, being tortured, and all they have sometimes is the looks at each other or the
Right.
comforting voices of each other, and they may come from in rival tribes, but by the time they both survive on the other side, they develop stronger bonds, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah, those shared experiences, whether they be good or bad, develops a community of sorts, and then through that, um, there's a sense of unity and potential identity. And this is where things can get a bit difficult, where your identity is rooted in a struggle or oppression. It may be difficult to escape that if you believe that, or maybe not escape it, but maybe. Oh, maybe that is the right word. Escape it or rise above it if you feel that that this is the root of your narrative, and you might feed into it. And what I mean by that is, if you believe that that your history is, I guess, founded by in oppression, you may always feel that you're oppressed, even though there may not be evidence that you yourself may be experiencing that.
yeah, because you see your experiences in the world, right? I mean, the world, the cultural lens through which you see the world is influenced by your experiences of that world, and so
Yeah. However, that may not be rooted in your reality. Let me give you an example. So there's this comedian um, who's fairly famous. He's a political comedian of sorts, um, and he used to be a host on this show called The Daily Show. Well, he has a stand-up act, so he's a stand-up comedian, and much of his stand-up revolves around dealing with racial issues and racial discrimination and navigating what it's like to be an Indian growing up in a very racialized America and how it's difficult for him. Many of the experiences that he um, presents are emotional tugs at the difficulty of being an Indian American. It's later revealed many of these stories are not true. That he admits to making those stories up. And the argument was, well, why would you make up such a story? Well, because the story of minorities in America is that we deal with these type of racial injustices and discrimination. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a history of that. But I think much of the critique of this individual is because he is aware, so aware, that minorities in this country face, especially brown people or people of color, face hostility or discrimination. He feels that he has to delve into that narrative. Otherwise, he is not perceived as a part of that community because he hasn't struggled. So you feel what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, and I hear this all the time in my African American history class. You got a black guy over here, and he's from, let's say he's from Oak Cliff, all right? So he's going through it, or he lives in an environment that's difficult. And then you got a black guy who lives over here in, let's say Mansfield, lives in Miralagos, 3-car garage. His life experience is different. But because they don't share the same struggle, it's going to be perceived that he's not as black as the other one. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And so when you don't have this same shared struggle, it almost makes it seem like, or feel that you're not a part of this community, a community that he thinks he belongs to, because in this country, we categorize people by their color. And in this particular case, he's inventing these racial discriminatory stories, almost as in a form of like emotional pornography of some sorts. Like, I'm selling you this story. Now, as a stand-up, if this were to be done in a film, there wouldn't be any problem with it for a reason that I believe to be because stand-up comedy is unique. It was perceived with a great deal of backlash. Again, the whole point of bringing that up is that sometimes if your narrative is rooted in struggle, you'll believe that you'll have to forever be in that struggle, and when that may not necessarily be the case. His life was fairly decent. Probably hasn't received or probably hasn't faced much discrimination racially.
Yeah, that's interesting. So identity and suffering have a strong connection with each other. I mean, it's not the only thing that creates identity, obviously, but it's a defining characteristic for identity. I often hear my wife, every time she talks about giving birth, she mentions she did it naturally, like with no medicine, and not saying that you ain't a woman if you didn't do that. There is this unstated, or this sort of like sense of pride that I'm still kind of woman because I was able to do this.
Absolutely.
And the Vikings, like death, there is, it's odd how humans can attach themselves to behaviors that are otherwise not necessary.
Like, yeah, I mean, that's weird, dude. And you just that example you just gave is pretty spot on, because what that tells us is that this isn't just an American thing. It's not a racial thing, and it's obviously not a orientation thing or sexual thing. That we have a tendency to designate our struggle as I guess in this case of, well, not to say that I feel like I'm more of a woman because I did it without the epidural or had it naturally, but there is this notion that there is a pure path of sorts,
right,
to your identity, and that the pure path of some identity is through living a hard life. That if I live through a hard life, I might be a better rapper, right? So like if when we compare rappers of our generation to the rappers of this generation, there was a tendency to focus on individuals that would rap about their authentic upbringing. Okay, well, times have changed, and now their upbringing is not so hard, and they're rapping more about emotions. They're rapping more about this, and so, but there's still this notion that, oh, if you're not rapping about this, well, then you're not a real rapper,
right? Or if you ain't it's I remember that back in the '90s, it was like, oh, you ain't been shot. How many times you been shot? No.
Dude, that's what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? And so it's
Yeah.
like, it's almost a rite of passage of sorts. Like,
Right,
oh,
right.
you've been locked up? Good. Well, now in order to be in the game, in order to be legitimized in hip hop, you have to have a record or a rap sheet. And again, it's this shared identity that is not unique to culture. It's not unique to race. It's not unique to gender. But it is this notion that there is a pure path, I guess,
Yeah.
to that identity.
To think about when rites of passage we find them at their earliest states. Maybe something to the effect um, of a burial ceremony. Maybe could be one of the earliest cultural practices that maybe stimulated or started the trend that would ultimately become what rites of passages are,
Mm-hmm.
which are these ceremonial sort of gatherings that invest meaning into the performance that occurs in order to um, foresee a transformation in an individual's life
Mm-hmm.
of some sort, right? Maybe not foresee, but or to um, just act out that transformation. It's
For sure.
like you have to go walk across the stage to get your degree, and you already
Mm-hmm.
got your degree. Once your grades in, you're done, but you
Mm-hmm.
don't feel you got it unless you go jump across the stage or do this or
Put your tassel to the left or whatever that
yeah,
nonsense is.
right. Like it's something about humanity that maybe it's connected to our ability to brainwash ourselves or put ourselves through certain patterns that are
I,
comfortable.
I, I just want to feel that, uh, that, yeah, you're right, that we've conditioned ourselves that to the belief that, um, that if there's a greater struggle, it's more authentic. I was talking to uh, Dr. Smith, Tiffany, and she was talking to me about her comps. And she was like, comps were the worst. I had to memorize 72 books just for this one comp. Um, but most people, by the time they make it to comps, it's really just this grueling rite of passage. Anybody can, I mean, by the time you get there, you're ready to complete them. It's just, can you get it done? Can you knock it out real quick? And yes, it is grueling, but she goes, but it's a process. It's a formality of sorts, if you will. Because by that time you're probably already built for your comps. Uh, and even with academics, we see this notion that this is a rite of passage, whether it's accepting a degree or completing your comps. Oh,
Right.
we would probably focus on, well, did you write a dissertation? Did you write a thesis? Or did you do a project? And then we look at it as if that diminishes their degree, because it wasn't done, I think, the way we believe academia should be done.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. Rite of passage. It's cultural phenomena.
It's unique to one culture for sure. The universal element would be the death in of itself, because you know that doesn't discriminate. But I guess how we handle death,
How we handle
with the
that exactly. Like so, I'm thinking that you got these humans that started becoming. They started coming to the realization that they could play with tools and work together to take down prey and get more nourishment. And in the process, they developed stronger bonds with each other. They started missing each other when they died because they needed each other more. And one way to cope with that uh, newfound pain would be the ritual of burial, or thinking of the metaphysical inquiry of sending your loved ones on to another area, oftentimes burying things with them that you feel they're taking with them somewhere, which would be the
Mhm.
early forms of of these practices. Um, hmm.
Yeah, for the longest time, I thought that open caskets were because we didn't have cameras. You know,
Hmm.
I think about my funeral all the time. I don't want one, but um, I sure as heck don't want my casket to be open, and I don't want no goofy picture of me either from like when I was 22 because that don't make no sense either. Uh, but it's like this might be the last time you see this person
Yeah.
in the physical form.
Right.
So of course you're gonna want an open casket. You want to see him one last time or her one last time.
Or the
And then
Egyptians would put all kinds of herbs and go into huge details of like meticulously uh, removing in a very delicate manner all the
mm,
organs and
mhm,
keeping things so preserved, um, sacred. And it reminds me like the earliest religious forms would be shamanism, right? That's the earliest form of religion that we have evidence of. Shamanism in Africa and Eurasia and the Americas, prominently, in different forms. Um, but there's always this rite of passage for one to become a shaman as well, where you have to, do some kind of difficult thing, like go smoke tobacco until you pass out in the jungle and stay there. And if you don't get eaten by a jaguar, then you've survived your rite of passage to start studying shaman practices. Like you think about how much pain and suffering had to go through the dudes who didn't make it, getting eaten up. It's like you think about all of these things. Maybe they're I don't know. It's interesting how the hope or um, the the feeling that you get from the accomplishment maybe is what drives these things to be so prevalent in all these different cultures. I don't know.
well, for I think when you mentioned women giving birth, I mean the drive is the continuation of life.
Yeah.
So there's a instinctual maybe motivator to buckle down and make it happen. Whereas for you, like you said, you're just passing those rocks. So I don't know, like your motivator is just this pain's got to stop.
Right.
Um, so I think the obvious differences there for in regards to motivation, but
Yeah. One's an emotional response to the situation. The other one is a rite of passage. Every that's what I don't know if I'm willing to say that, but I would guess that every culture on Earth has rite of passages, or
for
else you wouldn't be
sure,
a culture.
no,
It
no, for
makes
sure,
it's a defining characteristic of a culture, right?
right. I mean, there are rite of passages in subcultures. I can go to there's probably a rite of passage at a car dealership.
Yeah, they're everywhere. It's part of all cultures,
Yeah, yeah,
you
for
know.
sure.
Now the meaning of them, which what they take on, how they form, and all these other things. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason or connective thread to those. Now, that is something that's very meticulously unique and nuanced to each specific cultural circumstance. But they all do it. They all interpret behavior and actions in such a way as to motivate one to do this thing that one otherwise wouldn't need to do and could still end up with the same results.
Oh, I see.
I
I see what you're
still
saying.
got my degree if I don't walk across the stage. I'm
Right.
still a man if I don't pass a stone. You're still a woman if you don't go through the pain of childbirth. You still got a child if it's a C-section. Like, rite of passages,
You're still a
uh,
scholar without your PhD.
yeah, but rite of passages make us think that this is so important to ground me in my belief that I am this or I've done this. I am now a man because I'm circumcised, or I'm this because I'm that. Um, it's almost like the culture trying to convince you of what it has formed you into is real.
Right. And
That's why I want to talk about this. I got this idea for a book. It's going to take me another 10 years probably before I get started. But it's called The Ontology of Culture. Like
oh,
ontology
okay, okay.
meaning the like being, existence. Like culture is this is better understood sort of like this, like being is understood as being present, as being existent, independent of human and being and society, manipulating, twisting human, sometimes human bending and stretching it as well. But nevertheless, this thing that's growing and evolving and transforming and getting added onto constantly uh, into a web of significance. Um, and maybe rites of passages are one of the threads in that web.
Definitely, definitely, because those rites of passage, if they're not a thread, they're definitely a bonding agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're conduits. What they do is they bridge the gap between you and the other, and there are many variables that would separate me from you, but that one rite of passage is the thing that brings us together, that bonds us. Um,
I like that phrase, conduits of culture.
yeah, for
Um,
sure. Go ahead and put that in the book, and then make sure you give me a shout out and the acknowledgments or whatever.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Jacking the thesis. I think the word conduit is important. I've used it before to describe certain individuals that have what I believe to be a capacity to, um, I guess, navigate um, like a multitude of waters that
Hmm.
normally wouldn't be navigated, and that these individuals are necessary in society at all levels to bring people to different waves of consciousness.
Yeah,
I call them conduits.
yeah, I like that, and I'm going to add that to my discussion. I got a section in my third chapter in History 1301 where I talk about Atlantic Creoles, which is which are, they fit this very well, right?
Mhm.
Um, they can navigate through multiple worlds, and I talk
Right,
about
for
this
sure.
guy whose story is pretty interesting. His name's Kwasi Mukamba. He was in like Dutch Suriname. He started out as a slave, eventually got free, had a few slaves of his own, lived till he was in his 80s, discovered a route that got named after him, that made it into European books. And there's this image of him uh, wearing this comical looking uh, outfit that a Dutch king gave him in honor and referred to him as the great lover of whites. He looks kind of like an Uncle Tom type of character in this
Mm.
image. William Blake published of him like in the late 1790s sometime. Um, and clearly he knew what to say to white people to get his get up, to be able to own
Okay.
his own slaves, to be in charge, to not get killed. They
Hmm.
also talk about how he had this ability to kind of go and look at the enslaved people and just by looking at them determine who stole this or who did the thing that the master was looking for. They feared him, like he had this power because he understood African cosmologies of things like the obios, which is like a charm, right? This kind of like it's thing that's endowed with an inanimate object that's endowed with spirituality that existed in a lot of African cosmological worldviews that he understood and tried to get what he wanted out of those people. And what's interesting in that same book, they talk about him uh, going into this runaway slave community uh, and getting his ear chopped off and going to war and all these other things. But Richard and Sally Price, these anthropologists, were doing field work amongst the Saramanca, who are a community of formerly runaway slaves in this area of Suriname in South America.
Hmm.
and they had an oral history story. They never wrote this down, but they told them about this guy named Kwasi Mukamba of Chidu who came one day, and they have this whole interesting story about how the chief's daughter had a dream saying that Kwasi was bringing the whites, that he's going to ask for your obias, tell him it's somewhere over here. They tricked Kwasi, telling him that the obias was somewhere else. He shot all his bullets up into the sugarcane field, and then the Salamanca came and got him, chopped his ear off, and told him to go take it back to the white people to see what happens when y'all try to come out here and conquer us. And so it kind of got him in trouble every now and then, thinking he could go navigate through all of these cultural dimensions. African Atlantic Creoles could do that often. You could be on a pirate ship and speak pirate code. You can go in, talk to the white people the way you need to, the slave master the way you need to, talk to the enslaved people the way you need to, talk to other communities. But and it got him success, but it almost messed him up in a couple of occasions, right? And so it's interesting how this like cultural agency, or these people with this conduit culture, or the ability to navigate multiple worlds, multiple languages, multiple cultures. On the one hand, it's powerful. It's strengthening them. It gives them advantage, but they also take the chance of significant suffering and pain. Your ear chopped off.
Right.
If things go wrong, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's so that is indicative of culture, rite of passage.
Yeah.
It's definitely not beholden to any region of the world.
And I would be suffering. We also, in our culture, we have this idea of like, what would be the opposite of suffering, do you think? Pleasure, or would it be happiness?
Well, what does the Eightfold Path say of suffering? That suffering is life, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the ending of suffering is death.
The Eightfold Path says, suffering is a basic quality of life. Everybody suffers. If you suffer, you go through truth and nirvana. You can reach this higher state of being, enlightenment, he calls it.
Right.
Would that be opposite of suffering? Would enlightenment? Because you could certainly be
no. Well, I don't know, because no, it doesn't sound like what it sounded like you were saying to me was that suffering, through suffering, you experience nirvana. So that's in the here and now. So because you're exposed to the truth. Again,
it takes practice, though. Over time, you have to do that.
For sure.
Before you
that suffering is merely, I guess it's synonymous with experience, is what I'm taking from it. And that the lack of experience would be death. The lack of suffering would be death, because you're not conscious. It's only through your consciousness can you obtain awareness of self. That would be nirvana, no?
Yeah, oneness. I don't really know. It's hard to translate. Really, nirvana is like, some Buddhists call it moksha, or some Hindus call it moksha. You reach it. You're reaching another level. So, like, Hindus believe that you have recycle, but once you reach moksha, you break that cycle and you go to this higher state, which is also similar to nirvana. That the Buddhists would argue, if you suffer so strongly, you reach this point beyond suffering where pain ceases. You just elevate to a higher state of consciousness.
Oh, okay. So that's the end of suffering. I'm sorry. Okay, so nirvana would be the end of suffering.
It's interesting. But just specifically experiential, emotionally, at the core level, suffering and pleasure would maybe be the opposite of suffering, is what I'm getting at. Because happiness is something different. Happiness is something back to that elevation. It goes beyond just the emotion, I feel, or the sensory experience. Maybe that's what I should say. So the opposite, the opposing sensory experience from uh, pain and suffering would be pleasure.
Opposite sensory of pain would be pleasure. I don't know, because I often hear, you often hear that a parallel being made from some who align pleasure with pain.
Mm.
And you'll always hear individuals that, again, you make the argument like, I am going to enjoy this passage of rites because, even though it's painful, because of what the results will be. So I'm looking forward to this pain. So I don't know if it's a opposite.
Yeah. Well, you know what's key? What's the
feeling?
problem? The problem is the distinction between pain and suffering. People who take pleasure in pain aren't suffering. They're getting pleasure out of that pain. But suffering, I think, bears some sort of, usually it can be connected with pain because you can't endure it anymore, maybe. But when one is suffering,
There's a trial of sorts.
yeah, there's more.
It doesn't have to be physical, but there's a trial of sorts. That's suffering. Yeah. And suffering is not just experience. It has to be this experience that results in some type of distraught. It sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
So my definition of suffering as just an experience, a series of experiences, is not enough. That's too broad and it's too limited in scope. It needs to have the emotional element of distraught or discomfort.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time: the suffering's going to come. You might as well suffer studying on a regular basis, so that you can get the reward when the opportunity of the OTE comes around, instead of messing around, and then you're gonna suffer time when the OTE comes. And that suffering is worse.
It could be, and that's if that's if the equation implies suffering now does not result in suffering later, because it could be where you're like, you might as well take your suffering now. So I'm suffering now, and then come to find out my ass is suffering later too. Right. So that's just double the suffering. I don't need all that.
Magnified. Oh,
you got me suffering twice for no reason, right? Just because I didn't understand the original equation.
That's funny. That's funny, man.
But yeah, that's man. I was not expecting to go in this direction.
Yeah, for sure.
We definitely went on a more. Here's what I do appreciate. This would be more of like a sociological, or it's not anthropological, is it?
Yeah, I think so, because it's basically, it always gets down to my number one core interest, which is culture.
Culture.
Anthropological.
That's
right?
fine. Hey, and you tied in more cultural history than me. I'm just bouncing ideas back off of you.
I mean, that's interesting, because suffering also can be like rewarding. Like, I mean, you think about what's going on right now with this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Look how many people are suffering from the attack, but there's a lot of glorification of victory in the suffering for
sure.
Hamas, right? The suffering itself is a victory, because you sort of feel like you've been suffering all this time, and now you're perpetrating the suffering. You feel strength, you feel satisfaction or power, or
for sure. Misplaced strength, misplaced power, misplaced understanding of suffering. Dr. King would say violence brings about temporary peace. but violence will only beget more violence in that regard. That's why you have this wave of like revenge violence.
Yeah.
Um,
I'd like to do more studying on how much King knew about the revolutionary movements across Africa and the colonial um, wars in Africa and India. I mean, I knew he was familiar with nonviolence and things like this
for
with
sure.
Gandhi, but um, the real gritty colonial form of suffering that was perpetrated on people in certain areas of the world, I mean, it's almost impossible. Not almost, I think it is impossible to be nonviolent. Your response is going to naturally be violent against these certain colonial type of regimes, like the Belgians in Congo or the Portuguese in Guinea-Bissau, or uh, what the British in Sierra Leone, or in many cases, some of these areas in the Middle East since World War One,
Right, right,
where
right. I mean, there are definitely uh, violence is definitely rooted historically as the rationale, right? That is the rational approach to um, a revolution is violence. The more revolutionary approach would be to take the atypical route, which is nonviolence. Um, Dr. King's nonviolent approach may not be realistic. I think, oh my goodness, what's his name? Kenneth. Oh, God, it's slipping my head at the moment. Dr. King was giving this interview, and I think it's Lomax, Kenneth Lomax. Dr. King's giving this interview, and Lomax is having to admit that he did not believe that Dr. King's path of nonviolence was psychologically sound, because it's not your typical approach to a solution, which historically has been violence. A violence achieves an end, but King's argument is that you achieve an end, but it's always temporary, because then more violence comes, and then whatever you accomplished or achieved, and whatever you were holding for the time you were holding, will be violently overthrown. And so his approach was more of like an everlasting peace, I guess,
yeah,
through
which
nonviolence.
that sure as hell didn't work.
Well, for sure. But I don't want to say that it's rational. I do believe that it's revolutionary.
Yeah,
It doesn't sound like it makes sense, but
yeah, definitely. People willing to die for their beliefs and putting it on the line, and doing everything and purely in that regard, certainly revolutionary. Um, but I think misguided, maybe. Um, I don't know. I really don't know. It's hard. It's hard to say. I don't know. Um,
the
hu-
history tells us that it is. Say
I
again.
don't know. I don't know that humans will ever reach beyond violence as the number one tool that they use against each other. I think I don't know that we'll ever reach a time where we get to that point.
Well, so and why is that? Because violence doesn't require thinking. Right? So like I don't have to think to be violent.
Right.
You're
We all
again
without thinking a good portion of our life.
right.
You eat something, you go do this. A good portion of your daily activity is spent not thinking before you act. You know, and so when your emotions are high, you think you act quick. Now that doesn't say there ain't masterminds behind things, plotting and scheming and getting it ready to
Of course.
go, and then take advantage of the frustration and the pain, and the dude whose dad just got blown up next to him, or who's been living behind an open air prison his whole life, or having, you know, land taken away from them, or getting abused or beaten up. You know, these are the perfect right for the picking for uh, the Bin Laden type of masterminds to come and convince you to do something
Right.
that,
For sure.
you know,
And then begetting more violence.
right.
You know, it's a history of violence.
That
Is what
suffering
it is.
is drawing it in, right? Is the suffering is the code. These people would
Well,
not do something like this if they didn't have some suffering.
I think the revolutionary element of King's approach was, as opposed to going the violent route, let's try an emotional route. And that let me appeal to a different sense for once. You know, the revolutionary idea of sailing west to arrive east on this Indigenous Day. You know, was that not revolutionary?
Yeah.
And when all the data and all the intelligence would tell you no, just sail around Africa. Someone said no, let's try a path less traveled. It
I feel
didn't
like
work out for him,
King should have been a Buddhist.
of course. Well, I mean,
He would have
towards
been
the
more
end
productive as a Buddhist.
towards the end of his life, things were changing,
Yeah.
and then things had to change. Hey, we'll have to call it right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Running
I've
out
been
of time.
this this quote by Andre 3000 been staring at me here for a while. If you play now, you're gonna suffer later.
Fair enough.
And with that, I guess we are done for the night.
All right, man. We'll just call it
Till next time.
till next Monday. Oh, not Monday. Maybe next week. All right. See you guys there.
Peace.